The grandfather clock groaned to life, its pendulum swinging backward. My husband Elias slammed his shoulder against the oak door. It wouldn't budge. The shadows peeled off the walls, their skeletal fingers reaching for our son. I clutched the ledger, the ink still wet with secrets. The house had been whispering to me for months, and now it wanted payment. In blood. The tires of the SUV crunched over the gravel of the long, winding driveway, a sound like grinding teeth. Elias Johnson gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white and polished, matching the stark bleached collar of shirt number 14. He had checked his watch exactly 4 times since they crossed the Vermont state line. Outside, the sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of a blizzard that the local radio had described as a once-in-a-generation event. "We're making good time," Elias said, his voice clipped and surgical. He didn't look at his wife, Sarah, in the passenger seat. "If the velocity of the storm remains constant, we'll have the house secured before the first inch of accumulation." Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was busy apologizing to her seatbelt, which had snagged on her sweater. "I'm sorry, so sorry," she whispered to the nylon strap. She looked up, her hair falling out of its tuck for the 100th time. "It's so big, Elias. My father, he never told me the Blackwood estate was this big. This big." In the back seat, Leo was counting. 1, 2, 3. His voice was a rhythmic drone, his eyes fixed on the passing fence posts. Maya was hunched over her phone, the blue light of the screen casting a ghostly pallor over her face. The click-click of her digital shutter snapped through the cabin every time a jagged pine tree emerged from the fog. As they pulled up to the massive stone edifice of the Blackwood house, the wind shrieked through the dead needles of the surrounding forest. The house didn't just sit on the land, it seemed to loom over it, a jagged slate-roofed monster waiting to be fed. "Let's move. Efficiency is our only asset right now," Elias commanded. They scrambled toward the front door as the first flakes of snow began to fall. Huge, wet clumps that felt like cold ash against the skin. Elias jammed the heavy iron key into the lock, turned it, and shoved. The door swung open into a foyer that smelled of ancient dust and something metallic, like an open vein. But as soon as the last of them crossed the threshold, the wind outside died to a low, unnatural hum. Elias turned to close the door, his hand finding the heavy oak handle. He slammed it shut, the thud echoing through the cavernous house. "Check the perimeter," Elias said, already pulling a legal pad from his briefcase. "Sarah, check the kitchen. Maya, stay off the data. We need to conserve battery." "I'm going to the window," Leo whispered. 1, 2, 3. 10 minutes later, the realization hit like a physical blow. Elias had tried to open the back door to check the generator. He had walked through the kitchen, turned the brass knob, and stepped out, only to find himself standing back in the foyer, looking at the grandfather clock. "That's not possible," Elias muttered. He tried the side porch. He stepped through the frame, the cold air of the mudroom hitting his face, and then, with a sickening lurch of his inner ear, he was back in the foyer. "Elias?" Sarah's voice was trembling. "I tried to go upstairs. I climbed the flight, but when I reached the top, I walked out of the cellar door. The cellar door!" They were trapped. The blizzard raged outside, a wall of white static, but the house had folded in on itself. Every exit was a loop, a geometric trap that refused to let them leave. Elias felt a bead of sweat roll down his spine, staining shirt number 14. He checked his watch. The second hand wasn't moving. It was twitching back and forth, vibrating in place. Elias stood in the center of the foyer, the legal pad gripped so tightly the cardboard backing began to groan. He refused to let the panic settle in his gut. Panic was a variable that could be managed, a cost that could be mitigated. He began to pace, his leather shoes clicking against the marble floor with the precision of a metronome. "Everyone, stay in the foyer," he ordered, his voice echoing off the high, vaulted ceiling. "Maya, record this. I want a time-stamped log of every attempt to cross a threshold." Maya didn't look up from her screen, but the rhythmic click-click of her camera confirmed she was documenting the madness. "The GPS is spinning, Dad. It thinks we're moving at 60 miles per hour in a circle. A circle. Spatial anomalies," Elias muttered, scribbling on his pad. "The house is not adhering to a standard Euclidean layout. We are in a closed system." In the corner, the massive grandfather clock, a towering pillar of dark mahogany and polished bone, suddenly groaned. It was a sound like a giant's ribcage cracking. The pendulum, which had been still, began to swing. But it didn't move with the grace of time. It jerked, and it moved counterclockwise. Tick, tock, tick. With every swing, the air in the room changed. The smell of the modern world, the scent of Maya's hairspray, the leather of Elias's briefcase, was being sucked out, replaced by a thick, cloying atmosphere. It smelled of wood smoke, unwashed wool, and the sharp, biting tang of a 19th century winter. "Do you hear that?" Leo asked, his voice small. He was staring at the shadows beneath the grand staircase. "The house is breathing. It's breathing." Sarah was on her knees, her fingers tracing the grout between the marble tiles. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," she whispered to the floor. "We didn't mean to wake you. We're just visiting." "Nobody is visiting," Elias snapped, though his own heart was hammering against his ribs. "We are the legal owners of this estate. The physics of the building are irrelevant to the deed." But the shadows didn't care about deeds. As the clock chimed a low, vibrating note that rattled Elias's teeth, the darkness in the corners of the parlor began to thicken. It wasn't just an absence of light. It was something heavy, something with mass. The shadows began to detach themselves from the walls, stretching out into gaunt, translucent shapes. They were tall, impossibly thin, with limbs like charred branches. Elias saw a face manifest in the gray mist, a mask of hollowed eyes and a mouth frozen in a silent scream of starvation. "Get back!" Elias lunged toward the fireplace, grabbing the heavy brass fire poker. The metal was cold, biting into his palm. One of the shapes drifted toward Leo. It didn't walk. It flowed, the air around it shimmering with a localized frost. It reached out a hand that looked like a bird's claw, its fingers brushing against Leo's jacket. "Leo!" Sarah shrieked. The entity gripped the boy's shoulder, and Leo was suddenly yanked across the floor toward the cellar door. The wood of the floorboards shrieked as his heels dragged over them. "No!" Elias roared. He swung the fire poker with the desperation of a man losing his last asset. The brass head of the poker passed through the shadow's torso, but there was resistance, a feeling like swinging through thick, frozen honey. A spark erupted where the metal met the mist. The shadow let out a sound like a winter wind whistling through a cracked pane of glass. It recoiled, hissing. Elias didn't stop. He stepped between his son and the darkness, swinging the iron rod in wide, violent arcs. "Out! Get out of my house!" The shadows retreated, melting back into the wallpaper, leaving behind nothing but the smell of scorched dust and the lingering vibration of their presence. Leo lay on the floor, gasping, his chest heaving. 1, 2, 3. Leo choked out, trying to find his rhythm. Elias stood over him, the fire pokers trembling in his hand. He looked down at the floor where Leo had been dragged. In the struggle, the boy's heavy boot had caught on a loose floorboard, ripping it upward. Below the wood, tucked into a pocket of dry rot and insulation, sat a bundle of yellowed paper bound in rotting twine. Elias knelt, his fingers fumbling as he pulled the object out. It was a ledger, its leather cover cracked and peeling like sunburnt skin. On the front, embossed in fading gold, were the numbers, 1845. Elias opened the ledger, his eyes scanning the cramped, frantic handwriting. His analytical mind, usually so adept at finding the fix, felt like it was grinding on sand. "This isn't a family history," Elias whispered, his voice failing him. "It's a debt log." He turned the pages, seeing names he recognized from Sarah's genealogy charts. But the entries weren't about births or marriages. They were about calories. January 12th. 3 bushels of grain lost. The hunger grows. The house demands a tithe of blood memory to keep the winter at bay. "Sarah," Elias said, looking up at his wife. She was staring at the ledger with a terrifyingly blank expression. "You told me that digital detox was your idea. You said we needed to come here to disconnect, to find ourselves." Sarah's eyes drifted to the grandfather clock. "The house," it whispered Elias. "In my dreams. It said it was lonely. It said it needed us to come home. Come home." The realization settled over Elias like a shroud. The house hadn't just been a setting for their family vacation. It was a predator, and it had used his wife's vulnerability to lure its prey into the trap. The spatial loops, the temporal shifts, they weren't accidents. They were the walls of a stomach, closing in. The temperature in the foyer took a sudden, precipitous dive. Elias could see his own breath now, a thick, white plume that hung in the air like a ghost. He looked at his watch again. The glass face had cracked right down the middle, a jagged lightning bolt of a fracture. "We need food," Maya said suddenly. Her voice was flat, devoid of its usual teenage snark. I'm really hungry, Dad. Like I haven't eaten in days." "We just had lunch at the diner 3 hours ago," Elias said. But even as he spoke, a gnawing, acidic ache blossomed in his own stomach. It wasn't a normal hunger. It felt like a live coal sitting in his gut, radiating a hollow, desperate heat. "I'll check the pantry," Sarah whispered. "I'm sorry. I should have prepared." Prepared. She hurried toward the kitchen, her footsteps sounding heavy and sluggish. Elias followed her, his hand still gripping the fire poker. They reached the pantry, a modern addition filled with the comforts of the 21st century. Boxes of organic granola, tins of imported coffee, bags of artisanal pasta. Sarah reached for a box of crackers. As her fingers touched the cardboard, the bright yellow packaging didn't just fade. It disintegrated. The plastic crinkled and turned gray, crumbling into a fine, powdery ash that smelled of wet charcoal. "Elias," she gasped. He lunged forward, grabbing a can of soup. The metal felt cold, but as he held it, the weight vanished. He looked down to see the tin dissolving into a pile of gray dust that slipped through his fingers like sand. Every piece of modern food in the pantry was undergoing the same transformation. The house was purging the present, stripping away anything that didn't belong to the year 1845. The hunger in Elias's stomach intensified, a sharp, biting pain that made his vision blur. He leaned against the stainless steel counter, the metal biting into his hip. "The systems," Elias wheezed. "The smart home interface. If I can override the climate control, maybe I can slow the temporal shift. He stumbled back into the hallway, toward the sleek glass panel of the thermostat. It was a high-end model, a glowing blue circle that controlled the lifeblood of the house. He pressed his thumb to the screen, his mind already calculating the sequence needed to reset the boiler. The screen flickered. A line of red text scrolled across the glass. System error. Legacy debt unpaid. No, 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 Elias hissed. He punched a command, but the glass felt hot, unusually hot. A low vibration hummed through the wall, and then, with a sound like a gunshot, the interface shattered. Shards of glass sprayed across the floor, one of them slicing a thin red line across Elias's cheek. Behind the broken screen, etched into the very stone of the wall in a glowing, sickly amber light, was a series of numbers. They were counting down. 034212, 034211, 034210. Midnight, Leo whispered from the doorway. He was staring at the wall, his eyes wide and vacant. The Great Hunger Ritual. When the clock hits 0, we don't just stay here. We become part of the house. 1, 2, 3. Elias wiped the blood from his cheek, his mind racing. He was a fixer. He solved problems. He negotiated the impossible. But how do you negotiate with a century-old hunger? How do you audit a ghost? He looked at the hallway walls. The modern wallpaper, a tasteful eggshell blue, was peeling back in long, wet strips. Beneath it, the original lath and plaster were visible, stained with dampness. The family photographs Sarah had carefully hung along the corridor were changing. Elias reached for his wallet, pulling out a small Polaroid of Maya and Leo at the beach last summer. As he watched, the bright colors of the ocean bled into a muddy brown. The children's swimsuits transformed into tattered wool rags. Their faces, once bright with laughter, became gaunt and hollowed. Their eyes grew large and desperate, their ribs beginning to poke through their skin. They were no longer his children. They were the starving pioneers of the 1845 ledger. From deep within the house, a new sound emerged. It wasn't the wind or the clock. It was the rhythmic, metallic screech of metal on stone. Shh, ching, shh, ching. Someone, or something, was sharpening a blade. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, a predatory promise that made the hair on Elias's arms stand up. The Great Hunger wasn't just a metaphor. It was a physical event, and the house was preparing its cutlery. Elias! Sarah's voice came from the dining room. It was different now. Deeper, rasping, as if her throat were filled with dry leaves. Elias walked into the room, his hand tightening on the fire poker. Sarah was standing at the head of the long oak table. Her hair was completely loose now, a wild, tangled mane. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the empty plates. The blood memory, she murmured. It's so clear now. My great-grandfather. He didn't survive the winter because he was lucky. He survived because he was efficient. She turned to look at Elias. Her eyes were no longer the soft brown he had married. They were a cold, piercing blue, reflecting an ancestral malice he didn't recognize. In her right hand, she held a long, bone-handled kitchen knife she must have found in the depths of the old cupboards. The debt must be paid in kind, Elias, she said, her voice a hollow echo. A life for a legacy. Before he could react, she lunged. The move was primal, devoid of Sarah's usual hesitation. She swung the knife in a jagged arc aimed at his throat. Elias ducked, the blade whistling over his head and burying itself in the wood of the doorframe with a heavy thud. "Sarah, stop, it's me!" Elias shouted, grabbing her wrists. She was incredibly strong, her muscles corded with a supernatural tension. They grappled, knocking over a heavy mahogany chair. Elias could smell the scent of wood smoke and old blood on her breath. She wasn't his wife in this moment. She was a vessel for every starving soul that had ever died within these walls. "Let go," she hissed, trying to bite his hand. Elias used his weight to pin her against the table, his heart shattering as he looked into her transformed face. He didn't want to hurt her, but he couldn't let her kill him. He twisted her wrist, a move he'd learned in a corporate self-defense seminar years ago, and the bone-handled knife clattered to the floor. He shoved her back, and she collapsed into a chair, the blood memory trance breaking as suddenly as it had begun. She blinked, her eyes returning to their normal color, and she began to sob, a dry, hacking sound. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," she wept, her hands covering her face. Elias stood back, his chest heaving, his shirt number 14 torn at the shoulder. He felt a wave of nausea and cold terror. The house wasn't just trapping them, it was weaponizing their love, turning their own history into a blade. He looked at Leo, who was standing by the cellar door, watching them with an expression that was far too old for a 9-year-old boy. "Dad," Leo said quietly. "The ghosts from before, the ones you fought with the poker?" "What about them, Leo?" Elias asked, his voice shaking. Subverted Beat 2.5. Phase 1. Build Hope. Elias took a deep breath, forcing his analytical mind back into the driver's seat. He looked at the heavy brass poker in his hand, then at his son. "They're gone, Leo. I drove them back. I can do it again if they manifest. We have a plan now. We find the source of the loop, we break it, and we get out of here. My logic hasn't failed us yet. I mapped their movement. I know their patterns. I can protect you." He felt a surge of genuine confidence. He was the fixer. This was just another hostile takeover, only the board members were dead. He had the weapon, he had the ledger, and he had the will to win. Phase 2. False positive. Leo didn't look relieved. He walked closer to the cellar door, pointing at the heavy iron bolt. "You don't understand. Look at the wood, Dad." Elias knelt, inspecting the deep gouges in the oak frame. His eyes narrowed as he processed the data. The splinters weren't pointing inward, as if something had been trying to break in. They were pointing outward. The heavy iron bolt hadn't been clawed from the outside. It had been braced from within the hallway. The ghosts hadn't been attacking the foyer. They had been leaning their weight against the door, holding it shut. "They weren't trying to get us," Leo whispered. Elias felt a wave of relief. "So they're not the threat? They're just remnants? That's good, Leo. That means we don't have to fight them." Phase 3. The crack. Elias stood up, dusting off his trousers. He felt the weight lift from his shoulders. If the ghosts were harmless, the situation was manageable. But then he noticed Leo's face. The boy was backing away from the cellar door, his heels clicking in a jagged, uneven rhythm. "Dad," Leo said, his voice dropping to a terrified whimper. "If they were holding the door shut, why did they stop? Why did they let go when you hit them?" A low vibration hummed through the floorboards, rattling the teeth in Elias's skull. From beneath the floor, a sound emerged. Not a scream, but a wet, rhythmic thudding. It smelled of stagnant water and something metallic, like an open vein. Phase 4. Catastrophic reveal. The cellar knob turned, slowly, deliberately. The brass groaned under a pressure that made the heavy hinges scream. Elias realized with a gut-wrenching jolt of horror that his bravery had been a catastrophic blunder. By saving his son from the shadows, he had actually banished the only thing keeping the house's true master contained. The gaunt spirits weren't predators. They were the last line of defense, the terrified ancestors trying to keep the patriarch from rising. The cellar door didn't just open. It was blown off its hinges by a gust of freezing, foul-smelling air. From the darkness of the basement, a figure emerged. It was Jedediah Blackwood. But he wasn't a shadow. He was a physical presence of rot and hunger, his skin looking like parched earth stretched over a frame of rusted iron. He carried a heavy, serrated cleaver that dripped with a black, oily substance. You opened the way," Jedediah hissed, his voice a chorus of 1,000 starving whispers. Elias raised the fire poker, but it felt like a twig against the rising dark. By fighting the monsters, he had murdered their only protectors. Now, the debt collector was in the room, and he had brought his tools. The ledger in Elias's hand burst into flames, the heat searing his fingers as the house's history began to rewrite itself in real time. They weren't just trapped in a loop anymore. They were in the slaughterhouse, and Elias had just unlocked the gate. "Maya, get the light!" Elias screamed, his voice breaking. The hunger in his gut was no longer a dull ache. It was a screaming void, a black hole that threatened to swallow his very soul. He looked at Leo, and for a split second, he didn't see his son. He saw a source of protein. He saw a way to stop the pain. He bit his tongue until he tasted copper, the sharp sting of pain anchoring him to the present. "Maya, now." Maya scrambled forward, her hands shaking as she fumbled with her digital camera. The device was a heavy, professional-grade DSLR, its lens glinting in the dim light of the dying foyer. She hit the power button, and the small LCD screen on the back flared to life. In the oppressive 19th century gloom, the blue light of the screen was blinding. It was a sharp, artificial hue that didn't exist in the world of 1845. As the light hit the approaching form of Jedediah Blackwood, the patriarch recoiled. He let out a sound like a swarm of cicadas, his translucent skin blistering where the blue glow touched him. The shadows that had begun to creep across the ceiling withered, retreating into the cracks of the plaster. "It works," Maya breathed, her voice trembling. "The light, it's like a wall. It's too new for them. They can't touch the frequency." "Keep it on him," Elias commanded, though his own legs felt like water. "Move toward the clock. If we can reach the gears, we can end this." They formed a tight circle, Maya in the center, holding the camera like a holy relic. The blue light carved a path through the darkness of the hallway, a flickering sanctuary of the 21st century. Around them, the house groaned in protest. The floorboards buckled, and the walls seemed to pulse with a wet, rhythmic thudding. The hunger was a constant, agonizing pressure. Elias watched as Leo's eyes darted toward Sarah's arm, his small teeth bared in a way that made Elias's blood run cold. They were losing time. They were losing themselves. "Don't look at the shadows," Elias whispered, his voice a rasp. "Focus on the sequence. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps." They reached the foyer, the grandfather clock looming like an executioner's block. The pendulum was swinging faster now, the counterclockwise motion creating a dizzying blur of bone and wood. The amber countdown on the wall was a blur of red light. 000542. "The gears," Elias said, pointing to the small, ornate door on the side of the clock's casing. "We need to jam the mechanism. If the time stops, the ritual fails." He reached for the side of the clock, his fingers inches from the wood. But then, the air in the room didn't just turn cold, it vanished. The oxygen seemed to be sucked out of the space, leaving them gasping in a vacuum of ice and ancient dust. The blue light of the camera began to flicker. "Battery low," Maya whimpered. "Dad, the battery is at 5%. Just a few more seconds." Elias lunged for the clock, but a hand, cold, heavy, and smelling of the grave, clamped onto his shoulder. Jedediah Blackwood didn't just attack this time. He merged. Elias felt a surge of freezing energy pour into his spine. It felt like liquid nitrogen being injected into his veins. His vision turned a searing, necrotic white. He tried to scream, but his jaw locked, his teeth grinding together with enough force to crack the enamel. "Elias!" Sarah's scream sounded like it was miles away. He felt his body changing, his muscles expanded, tearing the seams of shirt number 14. His skin grew tight and dry, pulling back from his teeth until his face was a gaunt mask of famine. His thoughts, usually so orderly, so calculated, were drowned out by a single, deafening roar. Hunger. He turned to look at his family. He didn't see his wife. He didn't see his children. He saw meat. He saw life that could be consumed to fill the void in his chest. The possession was complete. Jedediah Blackwood was no longer a ghost. He was a man of flesh and bone, and he was standing in Elias Johnson's shoes. The monstrous version of Elias took a step toward Sarah, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by rusted wires. He raised the fire poker, but it wasn't a tool anymore. It was a club. "Run." A tiny, dying spark of Elias's consciousness whispered from the back of his mind. "Run." But the family was frozen in terror. They watched as their protector, the man who lived by sequences and shirts and safety, transformed into the very predator they were fleeing. Maya's camera let out a final pathetic beep, and the blue light died. The darkness rushed back in, thick and absolute. And then, the house shifted. There was a sound like a massive deck of cards being shuffled. The walls slid, the ceiling dropped, and the floor tilted. When the movement stopped, the foyer was gone. The stairs were gone. Sarah, Leo, and Maya were standing in a seamless wooden box. There were no doors. There were no windows. There was only the darkness, the smell of rotting peaches, and the rhythmic, heavy breathing of the monster that used to be Elias. In the windowless void, the creature that wore Elias's skin moved with a terrifying, predatory grace. He didn't need light to find them. He could smell their warmth, their pulse, their fear. He cornered Leo in what felt like a corner of the dining room. The boy was huddled against the wall, his counting now a frantic, whispered prayer. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. The possessed Elias raised the bone-handled carving knife he had retrieved from the floor. The metal glinted in the absolute dark, a sliver of silver reflecting nothing. As he brought the blade up, the tip passed through a stray beam of moonlight that shouldn't have been there. But the house was leaking reality. The polished steel acted as a mirror. For a fraction of a second, the creature saw its own reflection. It didn't see Jedediah. It saw Elias Johnson. It saw the man who had 47 identical white shirts. It saw the man who treated his family like a corporate restructuring project. Wait. The analytical spark in his brain flickered. This is an inefficient use of resources. The fixer within him, the part of him that could find a loophole in a billion-dollar merger, suddenly engaged. He looked at the ritual not as a curse, but as a contract. And every contract had a flaw. The great hunger requires a sacrifice of the bloodline to sustain the estate, he thought. the logic cutting through Jedediah's murderous static. But a sacrifice is a voluntary transfer of assets. Murder is an involuntary seizure. The debt cannot be settled through theft. It must be a gift. Asterisk. The realization acted like a wedge, driving a gap between his soul and the patriarch's possession. Elias! Sarah's voice pierced the dark. She wasn't running. She was standing right in front of him. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, wrinkled square of paper. It was the Polaroid from his wallet, the one that had started to change. She held it up, pressing it against the creature's chest, right over his heart. "Look at us," she commanded, her voice crackling with a strength she hadn't shown in years. "We aren't entries in a ledger. We aren't assets. We are your family. Look at the picture, Elias. Look at the present." The 1845 curse, built on the slow decay of memory and the grinding weight of history, could not process the instant photograph. The Polaroid was a modern relic, a chemical capture of a single, unrepeatable second. It was too fast, too bright, too now for the ancient hunger to swallow. The creature shrieked, a sound of tearing metal. Elias felt his mind snap back into his body with the force of a car crash. The gaunt mask of Jedediah peeled away from his features, dissolving into the freezing air. "Maya!" Elias gasped, his own voice returning, though it was raw and bloody. "The clock! The face is the anchor! Break it!" Subverted beat 4.3. Phase 1. Build hope. Elias felt the momentum shift. He was back in control, his mind clear and cold. "Maya, the fire poker! Strike the glass!" he yelled, his voice echoing with the authority of a man who had just found the winning move. He saw the path to victory as clearly as a spreadsheet. If they destroyed the clock, they destroyed the heart of the 1845 timeline. It was the logical conclusion. The source of the temporal loop was the mechanical heart of the house. Once the gears stopped, the present would rush back in, and the doors would reappear. It was a perfect surgical strike to end the nightmare. Phase 2. False positive. Maya didn't hesitate. She grabbed the brass poker from the floor and swung it with every ounce of her teenage rage. The glass face of the grandfather clock shattered into 1,000 glittering diamonds. She reached inside, her hand closing around the heavy bone pendulum. With a grunt of effort, she wrenched it sideways, jamming it against the wooden casing. The ticking stopped. The silence that followed was instantaneous and profound. The amber countdown on the wall vanished. The biting cold evaporated, replaced by the hum of the modern furnace kicking back to life. The walls shifted again, and suddenly, the front door was visible, the moonlight of a modern Vermont night streaming through the transom. "We did it!" Maya cried, dropping the poker. "The loop is broken." Phase 3. The crack. Elias let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for a century. He started toward his family, his hand reaching out to Leo. But as he stepped onto the marble floor, he noticed something. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was expectant. He looked at the shattered clock. A faint, wispy smoke was beginning to curl out from the broken gears. Not the smell of wood smoke, but something sweeter, like rotting flowers. He looked at the floor where the glass shards lay. They weren't just sitting there. They were vibrating. Maya was staring at her hand, the one that had touched the pendulum. A cold black stain was spreading across her palm, following the lines of her veins. "Dad," she whispered. "My hand, it feels heavy, like it's not mine." Phase 4. Catastrophic reveal. Elias's heart turned to lead. He realized, with a soul-crushing clarity, that he had made the ultimate error in judgment. The clock hadn't been the source of the curse. It had been the containment system. The temporal loop hadn't been a trap for them. It was a cage for the spirits. By shattering the face and stopping the pendulum, they hadn't ended the haunting. They had released it. The smoke from the clock erupted into a geyser of black mist, thousands of tiny, shrieking voices filling the room. They weren't confined to the Blackwood estate anymore. Elias watched in horror as the mist didn't just hover. It flowed toward the open front door, catching the wind of the blizzard. The spirits of 1845, the starving, the desperate, the predatory, were no longer trapped in a Vermont basement. They were being carried out into the world, a spectral infection riding the storm toward the nearest town. "What have I done?" Elias whispered. The house was quiet now, truly quiet, because the predators had moved on to greener pastures. The fix had been a disaster. He had traded his family's safety for the safety of the entire world. As he looked at Maya, her eyes turning that same cold, ancestral blue, he realized the Blackwood legacy hadn't ended. It had just gone mobile. The doors were open, yes, but there was nowhere left to run where the hunger wouldn't find them. The blizzard outside was no longer just snow. It was a white shroud carrying a century of starvation into the heart of the 21st century. Elias stood in the center of the foyer, his shirt number 14 ruined, his watch broken, and his logic shattered. He looked at his family, his wife who was an echo, his son who was a counter, and his daughter who was now a carrier. He walked into the kitchen, the modern LED lights flickering with a weak, dying energy. He opened a cabinet and found a box of crackers that hadn't turned to ash. He sat at the table and began to eat, the sound of his own chewing the only thing he could hear over the rising howl of the wind outside. "Efficiency," he whispered to the empty room, but the word had no meaning anymore. The Blackwood estate was just a house again, but the hunger was everywhere. The end.